your own taste. By about 1950, though, they started what they called milk co-ops, where the farmers would all put their milk together in literally in one big tank. And then the co-ops dealt with the individual dairies. Well, this was an advantage to the farmer because he could get a better rate for his milk because they were all buying from a similar source. But the downside of that is it kind of ended the individuality of the various milk flavors. Now you can go to San Francisco or New York or Cleveland or Chicago and order a glass of milk and it tastes pretty much the same. It wasn't always that way, but with the rise of the co-ops, that kind of ended. By the end of World War II, American society changed. Post-war prosperity brought the automobile to almost every family. And because of better processing and bottling techniques, we didn't need daily home delivery. We have refrigerators too, which added a lot to being able to keep milk fresh longer. Greater mobility led to the grocery stores starting to handle milk. In the old days, you brought your groceries home in a basket on wheels. If you tried to do that with a couple bottles of milk, they'd be in pieces by the time you got home. But once the automobile came and the people were able to get out of their homes and load things into their cars, it made it very practical for grocery stores to carry milk. In our particular market here, Lawson's Milk, they were the big enemy of all the neighborhood dairies because they started small carry-out stores on, it seemed like almost every corner. And they would give a little basket you could put your milk bottles in and carry it home yourself. Well, it was that plus a new marketing technique that the grocers were using. They were using milk as what they call a loss leader. Now, a loss leader is a great marketing term. Basically, the grocer was selling milk either at cost or even slightly below cost to get customers to come into a store. But knowing full well that you go into a grocery store, there's no way you're not going to pick up a few other items on the way through. Nobody's going to walk out just with a quart of milk. So it was worth his while to charge a much lower price for his milk. In fact, even today, you go into Heinen's or Tops or any of the big stores, I guess it's Giant Eagle now, they always seem to have the dairy cases way in the back of the store. Well, there's a reason for that. There's no way you're going to make it through that store without buying half a dozen other items. Well, it was these types of economic pressures and competition that drove the neighborhood dairies out of business. You could no longer make enough money selling a quart of milk to be able to put a man in a truck and send it around, deliver daily. By the mid-1960s, home delivery was almost to an end. They just couldn't compete anymore. We were all buying our milk elsewhere. Now we're moving on to Rocky River dairies. There were quite a few dairies in Rocky River over the years. There was a dairy called the Earl Carroll Dairy. It was at 1588 Worcester. That property now, this property now is where Lakewood Auto Body is on Worcester Road, right near the Heinen's parking lot. That little brick building originally was a Buick dealership. Now it's a body shop. I'm not sure if the dairy was ever in that building, but it was certainly on that location. We don't really know much about them. There was also an H.H. Sherman Dairy and an F.K. Speidel Dairy. Don't know when they were in business or even where they were in business, but they certainly were in business in Rocky River at one time. Dairyman's had a substation depot on Parsons Court over there next to the Rocky River Methodist Church. It wasn't a dairy per se, it was a distribution center where the processed and bottled milk was stored so the milk trucks could go and refill the trucks without having to drive all the way back to the west side. But we're getting back to two large bona fide dairies that were here in Rocky River. One was Schneider Bruce, which was over on Linda Street. The buildings are still there, directly across the street from Treats Restaurant. The buildings look about the same way they did when Schneider Bruce was operating there. They operated up to about the early 1960s before they went out of business. And last but not least was the Walter Barrett Creamery, which was at 19621 Lake Road. And that's what we talked a little more in detail about here. This is the Walter Barrett Creamery on Lake Road. You probably recognize the building. It doesn't look too much different today from it did in the 1930s.
There's another shot
Of the same property. You can see in the background there. That building there is the basket factory, which you'll be hearing a little bit more about a little later on. Walter Barrett was born up in Chesterville, Ontario. This is the full family homestead. The ground up there was really lousy, lots of rocks. You couldn't grow anything up there. So Walter Barrett came from a large dairy family up in Canada. There he is standing behind his mother. He was the oldest of the 7 children and decided he didn't have much of a prospects here on a family farm with all these other siblings. So in 1910, he moved to Cleveland. He was 18. In 1916, he married Marie Vanza and got a job with the Telling Bell Vernon Company. The Telling Bell Vernon was one of the largest dairies in Ohio. He was rather successful with them and eventually became their sales manager. During the 1920s, bought a new home in West Park near Cam's Corners, was living very well. His favorite car had a Pierce or a Roadster. You know, he couldn't have been doing too badly. Then 1929 came along and the stock market crashed and things changed for everybody, including Walter Barrett. He lost just about everything but his job and his home. But things had to change, and the Telling Bell Vernon transferred him from Cleveland up to Ashtabula. So up there he moved with his family and lived there for 2 years, setting up a new bottling plant for Telling Bell Vernon, and got some very valuable experience. About 1932 or so, he moved back into Cleveland and decided to go into the dairy business for himself. They lived in a large mansion on Detroit Avenue at the corner of Spring Garden and Detroit. In the old days, up and down Detroit Avenue, they were full of large, beautiful homes that the successful farmers had built fronting Detroit Avenue. But by the 1930s, the banks owned most of the big properties, and this house is no exception. But they were able to rent this house because it was on Detroit, it was a commercial street, so you could run a business out of your home. And that's exactly what they did. He was able to cut a deal with the Cochran family, who owned Hillside Dairy, which is a big dairy on the east side, and came to an agreement with Hillside Dairy to bottle milk for him and deliver it to the west side to him in bulk in unnamed bottles. And door to door, he would knock on people's door and get people to decide to take milk from the Barrett Creameries, which would have been about, we're probably looking early 1930s. He became a broker for himself, built up a customer base, set up a lot of whatever trucks you could buy during the Depression. He didn't drive any milk trucks, nobody could afford those. He had an old flour truck, I think he had a hearse. Whatever you could find those days that you could take from door to door and deliver milk is what Walter Barrett did. During the Depression, a lot of the payment for the milk was done in scrip. I don't know if any of you remember scrip from the Depression days, or like food stamps. Things were very tough. With the processing of milk, a byproduct was skim milk. Once you've taken the butter fat out, you had skim milk. Well, there was a lot more skim milk than they could possibly use. And what a lot of the dairies were doing was dumping it down the drain. You couldn't sell it. It didn't have a shelf life. And unfortunately, a lot of it went down the drain. My grandfather was doing with the skim milk then, was putting it into cans like this. We take it over to the fire station over at Kenilworth in Detroit and set it up there, and it was free milk for anyone who wanted to come and get it, because people literally didn't have enough money to feed their children with milk. Well, this is a very noble thing to do, but it didn't make any friends with the other dairy producers who were desperately trying to stay in business too. And here we got Barrett giving milk away. But those were the times. Milk in those days, if you paid retail for it, was 7 cents a quart. In 1935, having decided that there might be a future in this business, Walter Barrett came up with enough money, was able to beg and borrow, enough money to pick up the property out there that had formerly been the home of the Common Pottery Works on Lake Road in Rocky River. Here we have a photograph of the old house. Again, it doesn't look too much different than it did in about 1920. Of course, you can't really see very well, but on the porch are standing Guy Cowan's parents, who lived there for a while. And in the front yard, 2 of Guy Cowan's children. But when Cowan Pottery went out of business in 1931, these buildings all stayed empty for 4 or 5 years. Windows were broken, birds were flying in and out. It was a pretty desolate situation. The first year that the Barretts had moved into Rocky River, the house is in terrible shape, so they had the house remodeled. This is the barn out behind the house. In fact, the picture was just taken last week. Now it's Advanced Electrical Contracting offices in there. But in about 1920, the Cowans took this building and changed it from a barn into their offices. And they had that this was actually where the Cowan Pottery offices were, and behind it was their packing and shipping department. Well, this building, they had also been sitting empty. It was in pretty rough shape in 1935. The Barrett family moved into the barn and lived in the barn for the first season until the house was done. I broke my grandmother's heart to move from this fabulous mansion on Detroit Avenue into a barn in Rocky River. But after a year, they moved into a real house and started living again. But during that same time, they were setting up a milk production facility. My grandfather had had previous experience having just done this for Telling Bell Vernon and Ashtabula, so he knew where to get all the proper equipment, or was able to set up a very modern and efficient dairy. In 1938, they opened up an ice cream parlor in this building here. You can see Lower Barrett Creamery Company. You can't see in this particular picture, but there's a little sign down the lower right-hand corner that says, "Now open." So this probably dates from about the time they first opened up the ice cream parlor. This building had originally been built by the Cowans, was going to be their new showroom. But before they could finish the inside of it, they went bankrupt. And so this building also sat empty all those years. Here's a picture of the inside of the ice cream parlor. Probably about the only interior shot we have of the building. Now these are Guernsey cows. My grandfather bought this Guernsey milk from about 8 or 9 farmers down in the Lodi area. He was able to cut a deal with the farmers and to produce the particular milk that he wanted. Now these cows here, actually, one's a cow, the other one's a bull. I know that much about them. But these are Guernseys. Now, I'm just a city boy, and I don't know much about cows. In fact, I've never even met a cow. But my grandfather knew cows. He'd grown up on the farm. He knew cows literally inside and out. But the Guernsey cows were his favorite. They produced a very rich milk, very high in butterfat content. They didn't produce as much milk as more of the popular Holsteins and the Jerseys, but they came out with they made a very good milk product. Here is I don't know, you probably can't read it from where you are, but I have hundreds of them here later on if you'd like to come up and take a couple of samples as a souvenir. These are our milk invoices from the dairy days of all the Guernsey products. On the lower part here it says Guernsey milk products. Well, every day we would take a truck down to Lodi area and bring the milk back in large cans like this. This milk can, when it was full, was about 80 pounds. The can itself weighed about 20 pounds. So you've got 100 pounds of product here, which is why a lot of the dairy fellows had strong arms and broken backs. For quite a few years, they went down and picked up their own milk. They eventually hired a milk hauler that would bring these cans up and deliver them to Rocky River. They'd be put on a conveyor. The conveyor would be rolled into the building where the milk was poured into a milk scale where it was weighed and inspected for purity. It was then pumped into a pasteurizing vat. This thing here was quite large. It was probably about 4 or 5 feet tall. It held several hundred gallons of milk. There's a steam jacket. All inside this whole jacket, they would run steam through it, and the agitator would keep stirring the milk. And the milk was heated to a certain temperature for a certain period of time, which would kill all the bacteria in the raw milk, so that you could drink it. This was very carefully monitored. You had to keep records for the state inspectors. It was just one of the ways that we kept anyone in business in those days had to keep the milk pure. The milk was then pumped earlier, or into this item. This is a cream separator. A large motor here would spin the milk at tremendous speeds, and it would separate the cream from the milk, so that you could butter, cream, buttermilk, various dairy products. Then it was brought in, and this thing is a milk bottle machine, 1930s vintage. The milk was in this big tank at the top. It was pumped in through a pipe at the top. These little nozzles here would gravity feed the bottles that were in these little things here. The clean bottles would come off the line out of the bottle washing room. They'd be filled by this machine. They would go on to another machine that stuck a little cardboard milk cap, punched it into the top of the bottle, and then the same machine would swing the bottle around, cut a piece of cellophane tape or cellophane paper, and fit it over the top and wrap a piece of tape around it. Now this is all done in lightning speed. It was very interesting to watch, and for a 7 or 8 year old like I was at the time, it was really interesting when the machine goofed up, which it did quite frequently. The bottles would be flying off the line and crashing on the floor. Oh, milk all over the place, broken glass, everybody racing around trying to shut the machinery down. For me, it was very entertaining. Probably wasn't too entertaining for the plant people, but those are some of the things I remember, the excitement in the dairy. If it successfully made it down the milk line, they would put in the milk crates and immediately put into the cooler, because the milk was still warm from being pasteurized. You had to lower the temperature to get it down cold. Once the milk was cooled, it would go into the trucks and be delivered. Back out into the ice cream parlor, out in the front lawn, they also had a custard stand built in the shape of a wooden boat, which was appropriate to the Rocky River community. There in the inset, you see my father and my Uncle Art. He was in grade school, my father was in high school at the time, and they kind of ran the custard stand out front. After about a year or so, during the winter one time, some kids came along and caught the thing on fire and burned it to the ground, and that was the end of the custard stand. But the dairy store went on. You can see a young couple here in front of the dairy. Young girl there was her first summer job. She was 16. This is the summer of 1942. The young handsome fellow on the left there was the boss's son. Well, these two became an item. And a little later on, the boss's son went off to the Pacific to fight in the war. And a few years after they came back from the World War II, all the soldiers came back. This couple was married and became my parents, Tom and Angela Barrett. And almost 60 years later, they're still happily married, and they're sitting right here tonight. So give them a good hand. You can see here, these are the milk trucks we used to use. Kind of funny little boxy trucks. These are called Walker Gas Electrics. Now, we all talk about today about the new hybrid vehicles that operate on gas, electric, so on. So did these. There's nothing new under the sun. The Walker Gas Electrics had a gasoline engine in the front with a dynamo attached to it, which generated electricity to run. The rear axle had an electric motor in it. These were great delivery trucks because there were no transmissions or no shifting. It was just a forward, reverse, and a brake. And the driver could operate it walking alongside of it or standing up whichever way you felt brave enough to do. But they used these trucks right up until the very end. The wartime shortages and rationing made it very difficult to make quality ice cream products. I remember my grandfather getting into trouble with the government because his milk and ice cream was too rich, had too much butter fat in it. Well, during the wartime, you couldn't have that. I think out of frustration, though, during the war, he stopped making ice cream, and he sublet the ice cream store to a chicken in a basket restaurant. That was the new fast food in those days. You get fried chicken in a basket of fries, real heart attack in a basket, but very popular, and it was served by the little car hops would come out. It was a great location. Both the ice cream store and the chicken in the basket store being right on Lake Road. Before the days of the interstates, Lake Road was the east-west route from Cleveland to Parks West. Big, heavily truck traffic, close to Huntington Beach. My dad tells me back in the days when Huntington Beach had a rainstorm, everyone would leave the beach at the same time and head back to Cleveland, and they'd all stop off for an ice cream cone at once. But it was a very good location for a restaurant. By 1958, it became very difficult to remain profitable in the dairy business in general, and the Barrett Creameries sold out to Oberlin Farms, and that was the end of the Barrett Creameries. So you can see the rise and the fall of neighborhood dairies. Originally fulfilling a very important community function, but made obsolete by changing society. So let me raise a toast to the milkman. Once a familiar sight in our community, but now only a memory. Thank you.
Now we'll move along to our last presenter this evening. Jack Hogue is a grandson of John Hogue, and I have to mention something to you before you begin. When I was about 5 years old, my grandfather took me into the bank at Rocky River and introduced me to your grandfather. And I still remember that. He was a very, very big man physically, and it was just great to have a chance. He actually reached over and shook my hand, and I still remember that very well. So at any rate, Jack, I'm anxious to hear what you have to say.
Well, thank you. In terms of preparing this from a panel standpoint, I felt it best to set a timeline from the standpoint of John Hogue in terms of who he was, how old he was, when he did the things he did. And along the way, in terms of conversation with other people, I have discovered some very interesting facts which I'll share with you tonight. One interesting point, John Hogue and his wife Edna were born a day apart in the same year. One was born November 8th, 1876. That was my grandmother, Edna Pease Hogue. And then John was born the next day, November 9th, 1876. The family farm that they had was basically across the street from where you know Westwood Country Club. His father, Henry, was a stone cutter. He worked for a marble factory in Cleveland, and he was a superintendent over 20 employees. In that trade, they called them lifters and leaners. Now, you know who the hard workers are in terms of the lifters. The leaners, I think, just stood around and didn't do a whole lot. Anyway, they had the farm. Now, John was the oldest male in the family, so I think he was exposed to the farm in terms of the actual work that needed to be done on the farm. And most of the products that they raised were row crops. They would have like beets and carrots and radishes, crops that didn't take up a whole lot of space. And the interesting thing was, and I'm not sure if you can see it that well, but what they would do is they would load up the wagon, working from like sun up. Up their team, and they would have to go to the same market that Rocky River growers would have to go to. In lieu of that, it took them probably 2.5 hours just to get to Rocky River. Now, the thing that I find so interesting is this, that the farmers had worked all day and they would hitch up their team of horses. Do you know when the farmer slept that was leading that wagon? He was sleeping while the wagon was traveling from the farm to the market. Now, today you have GPS, but back then you had a horse that knew where to go. He knew that where the traffic was and everything else, and he could get, because he knew the final destination. And probably the same thing was true in terms of the dairy farmer that had a horse with the wagon hauling the milk around to the customers. That horse knew where to stop. Probably he could see the milkman coming back to the wagon, and he knew when to start up again, and he knew where to stop again. And so I just found it interesting that that you could consider a horse had more technology back then in terms of traveling from point A to point B, where the driver could sleep the whole way. Anyway, John Hope was married to Edna Pease in 1898. And he ended up renting a parcel of land on Center Ridge about a little over a mile west of Wager Road. And he ran this property for 7 years. And he built up his equity. He started with just like $500, and he was able to build up equity there, and he farmed this land for like 7 years. And unbeknownst to what had happened, I'm not sure exactly what the health status was, but his wife Edna and John moved out to Colorado in the summer of 1907. And I believe probably because of the hot springs that were out there, it was very healthy for my grandmother at that time. And my grandfather, even though he might have had the horse team hauling the produce off to the market, he actually led a team of horses that had the payroll wagon that would deliver the payroll for Wells Fargo to the various mines out in Colorado. So he moved from a you might say a market man taking his produce to market with a team of horses to the Wild West taking the payroll on to the mines. I found that quite interesting. John and Edna had 4 children. Ruth Hogue Springer. She was born in 1899. Lucille Hogue Dray was born in 1901. And Josephine Hogue Pleasance was born in 1904. Now, Josephine was the first librarian for the Rocky River Library, I believe. And the Brown Pleasance florist shop was, her husband was the Pleasant part of the Brown Pleasance florist shop. And they had the florist shop across from the Lakewood Hospital, as you know. Anyway, and my dad was born in 1907. Now, John's, between Ruth and Josephine and my father, there was only 5 children from that generation. And